why not invite Taiwan to these drills, even as an observer, given that, Taiwan a lot of times is at the center of concern in Asia in terms of security?
They have to prepare for contingencies that involve Taiwan, but at the same time, they don't really want them to be in the room because of the political ramifications of if they were to cooperate with them militarily.
How has deterrence changed given the new threats that we're facing in the region?
When considering deterrence, the frustration with it is that we only know when it doesn't work.
Xi Jinping is to use a jargon term, a personalistic dictatorship. All the decisions really just come down to him. So instead of trying to deter an entire system, which has its own checks and balances, we're now just trying to deter one individual.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Hamiokan sitting in for Divya Gopalan. Now this summer we had the privilege of traveling to Hawaii to witness the world's largest naval exercises known as the Rim of the Pacific, or RIMPAC. The war games involved 40 ships, 150 aircraft, and 25,000 personnel from 29 countries. The drill lasted over a month and came to a close earlier in August. While we got the chance to see some of the maneuvers firsthand and speak to the people involved, it did bring up a lot of other questions. So today, we'll be getting insight into the relevance of these military exercises and how they play into the current geopolitical tensions in the region. We're joined by Jessica Renee Taylor. She's a logistics officer with the U.S. Air Force Reserve, having served in South Korea, and is now a security analyst with the Atlantic Council based in Washington, D.C. And joining us from Minneapolis, we have Raymond, the director of the Taiwan Policy Initiative at the RAND Corporation. Now, Jessica, I want to first start off with you. Looking at this year's RIMPAC, what were the biggest takeaways for you?
I think some of the biggest takeaways were some of the innovative features that countries like South Korea brought to the exercise rather. And I think especially in a bit of time where we have these growing geopolitical tensions, the fact that these states are still willing to come and be a part of this exercise was a huge component of it, especially as we see this growing alignment with Russia and North Korea.
And Raymond, what about you? Looking at RIMPAC, 29 countries is a lot. What did you take away from this drill?
I think that's absolutely right. 29 countries is huge. One advantage that the United States has compared to its other peer competitors like China or possibly even Russia is the fact that it has such a broad network of security partnerships and alliances. And so for this particular RIMPAC, we're talking about countries coming from South Asia like India, from Europe like Germany, from Latin America like Peru. There are very few other countries in the world that can bring together such a diverse group of countries and other participants, and also just the sheer range of ships and vessels that were there, including both support ships, surface vessels, and also submarines as well.
And Jessica, I see you shaking your head, especially the diversity part. How important is that, the fact that countries like Peru and Mexico are also getting involved with bigger militaries like the United States?
Oh, it's a huge deal, and I'm glad Raymond brought that up because it gives us an opportunity to exercise interoperability in the case that we are in the future would have a conflict. So it allows for other states to have a share in the conflict. I remember some past exercises and conflicts I've been a part of that having to try to figure out interoperability in the mix of a conflict. You want to try to have that fixed and ready to go prior to a conflict. So it really gives that opportunity to see how systems work. It's the submarines and airframes, but also just our computer systems and making sure that we are able to talk to each other.
And it's really interesting because when we were in Hawaii, that's one word that we could not hear enough of: interoperability, integration, right? The participants that were in these drills were very clear about the concerns with China. But Raymond, I want to bring you in here. How much of these drills really are about countering threats from China?
Countering threats from China is an important part. This is why we're seeing countries like Korea, the Philippines, even Indonesia being part of these exercises. It's because they have common maritime interests, and especially within the South China Sea and the East China Sea, China has increased its level of maritime coercion and economic coercion as well. And so, I think it's one question that attends to all sort of multilateral exercises and multilateral coalitions is, yes, you may be able to gather together a significant amount of capabilities, but can you actually talk to each other? Can you actually work with each other? I think Michael Beckley in his 2015-2018 book said that the Chinese rivals within the region, excluding the United States, actually have as much capability as the Chinese military. The main weakness, however, is that they're all fragmented. You have a divide and conquer strategy being pursued by Beijing. And so the solution is simple and obvious, but also very, very difficult to implement, which is to bring those countries together into a coalition where they can work together. And that's exactly what RIMPAC achieves.
Well, for the longest time, the United States military has been unmatched in power and reach. But as Justin Logan, director of the defense program at the Cato Institute, says, that might not be the case anymore in Asia.
The balance of power in Asia has shifted, and the United States can't be all things to all people anymore. And the United States loves nothing more than reassuring our allies. That's what we do. We come and we say our commitment is a guarantee. But trusting that commitment too much could be very dangerous. For countries all around the world that have been, maybe reassured to death in some sense by the United States. So it's a very fraught time, and there's a real lag in terms of the policy response in Washington.
Very interesting reactions from the both of you. I'll start first with Jessica. Jessica, is that true? I want to get your thoughts on that. Is there that lag in actual movement and action towards Asia?
I wouldn't necessarily call it a lag, but I do think there is something to be said that, we would need to work with our allies and partners, that the United States can't do it alone. Just by looking at the sheer distance that the United States shores are from the region, for me as a logistics officer to get assets into the region, if I want to support South Korea, for instance, I'm likely going to move in requests from Japan to move forces through Japan to support the Philippines. I'm going to want to use other bases in other states in the region from our allies. So I think, and I think the United States is working with our allies and partners to move towards more of a synergistic type of cooperation amongst our alliances for this particular reason. But I fully stand behind our commitment to our allies in the region, and I think some of that lag would be just by sheer distance, not because of a lack of commitment.
Yeah, and Raymond, I want to get your thoughts on Justin's comments about the balance shifting in Asia, and also your thoughts on what a lag time could mean for Taiwan, given that we've seen the speed at which China is able to create these kind of snap exercises around Taiwan. Can I get your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So I think, I think Justin's correct that the balance of power in Asia has shifted, and it has shifted against, say, the United States and its security partners and allies. That said, I think, I don't agree with Justin that the U.S. has reassured allies to death. In fact, I think what we're seeing over there right now is that there's this clamoring for deeper security engagement with the United States because they're not entirely certain about exactly how committed the United States is. When we say we're fully committed to Japan, then South Korea has to be worried that are we more committed to them than we are to them. And so it's a really careful balancing act that the United States has to engage in order to reassure this panoply of allies and security partners that we have in the region, that we have their back, all of them. But I also want to say that this sort of precarity, perhaps, in terms of alliance commitments can actually be very helpful for the United States. It can suggest to many of them, to many of the allies, they have to do more. Now, how many of you specifically asked about Taiwan? I think there is a concern here because Taiwan is outside of this network. And so it tends to give the Chinese the initiative. But I think that just means, it just reemphasizes the point that the U.S., along with its partners and allies, needs to get those plans in place in advance so that it can respond quickly to any kind of Chinese provocation.
And I'm really happy that you did bring that up because Taiwan is one of the countries at the forefront of China's coercive actions, but so is the Philippines. Now, Taiwan was not invited to RIMPAC, even as an observer. And while the Philippines had personnel, they couldn't spare any ships due to territorial disputes and tensions in the South China Sea. Now, Commodore Jay Triella, the spokesperson for the Philippine Coast Guard, spoke to us about the importance of military exchanges.
These kind of exercises, activities, between Coast Guards, and also the Armed Forces of the Philippines is also reaching out with foreign navies. This kind of interaction, mill to mill, person to person engagement with all of this military services and Coast Guard services is actually also a good avenue for us to really tell what is happening in the West Philippine Sea and how China is carrying out their operations, undermining our own position. So those kind of engagement is really important for us to tell China that Taiwan and the Philippines were not alone in this fight.
Jessica, I want to get your thoughts, given the complex situation that we face in Asia, just South China Sea, Taiwan Strait, Korean Peninsula. What the importance of cooperation? What does it say? The fact that the Philippines wasn't even able to send just one ship to this drill. What does it say about the situation now?
I think that shows how fraught the situation is between the Philippines and the PRC. I wouldn't necessarily equate that to the Philippines not supporting allies and partners, or the U.S. allies and partners, because it was an exercise. So if we instead, would look at military readiness on a day-to-day basis, can be different from military readiness for an exercise, for instance. So I would still look at the Philippines as being a strong partner, a strong ally, and taking its readiness concerns seriously.
And Raymond, I want to get your thoughts on the Taiwan side. The other, I don't want to say wasn't invited, but not able to go to RIMPAC. What does it say? Why not invite Taiwan to these shows, even as an observer, given that Taiwan a lot of times is at the center of concern in Asia in terms of security?
I think this is you point to a clear tension in U.S. strategy, and I think global strategy when it comes to Taiwan. Taiwan's the focal point for a lot of these conflicts, whether we're talking about across the strait or even the South or East China Seas. And yet, if Taiwan ever shows up, most countries tend to run away. And so the hosts of RIMPAC, participants in RIMPAC, have a little bit of a balancing act to do. They have to prepare for contingencies that involve Taiwan, but at the same time, they don't really want them to be in the room because of the political ramifications of if they were to cooperate with them militarily. I think this actually is a point that I made earlier about the disadvantages of strategic ambiguity. Because the United States doesn't engage more deeply with Taiwan in terms of military and security exercises and coordination, other countries in the region are also a little gun-shy about doing that as well. And there's a clear, obvious hole. If you're going to be engaged in a cross-strait conflict or a South or East China Sea conflict, Taiwan's going to be part of it. Do you really want to have a lack of coordination on such a critical node, geographic node, in these types of operations? It's unfortunate that the politics right now doesn't allow that, but I understand, unfortunately, why that is the case.
And Jessica, from a military perspective, I understand there's some complexities there with involving Taiwan. But even when we were in Hawaii, a couple of days before we landed, there were reports of a Taiwanese Coast Guard ship that was docked there. Can you speak a little bit about the other avenues of cooperation that maybe Taiwan could maybe look for in maybe cooperating with allies and partners? Maybe, I'm not trying to say under the table, but doesn't have to be official. Is that maybe a possibility?
I think that's possible. I mean, there have been other areas of cooperation that are, away from considering a conflict with China. I think Raymond brings up a really good point about, if there is a conflict in the region, even though we would like to all avoid that, we all should be preparing for the possibility, because at the time of a conflict is not the time to try to figure out how we're going to handle things if there's something that happens on the Korean Peninsula and across the strait. It's just not enough time. So if there is cooperation in other areas that are great power conflict, it gives us also the opportunity to ensure that we practice things like interoperability. But there is always that concern that that we are then being seen as antagonizing China.
Absolutely. And as we mentioned, RIMPAC participants are working together against a common threat. Now, Connected's Tomasz Koper was with me in Hawaii to find out how effective these kinds of exercises are at deterring modern conflict.
When Russia annexed Crimea and started a proxy war in eastern Ukraine, the interest in deterrence was revived. But the old understanding of how to deter aggression did not necessarily fit the new global reality, methods, and adversaries.
So the PRC, North Korea, and the former Soviet Union, so Russia, are much more aligned today than they probably were over the past 30 years after the end of the Cold War. So their geostrategic interests, as they define them, seem to be much more aligned right now.
And one of China's core geostrategic interests is bringing sovereign Taiwan under its rule, against the wishes of the United States and the Taiwanese themselves.
祖国统一是历史必然，两岸同胞要携手同心，共享民族复兴的伟大荣光。
Chinese armed forces pressure Taiwan by sending ships and aircraft into surrounding areas, but stop short of crossing into its territory. China also lays claim to the entire South China Sea, where its Coast Guard regularly clashes with Philippine vessels. But so far, they haven't used lethal force.
And we're seeing China taking some action, such as using water cannons, for instance, which are very much skirting the line of aggression, and the principle of aggression. And so, where does deterrence begin and end? In some cases, what we're seeing is that it kind of depends on what red line the partner or the U.S. wants to set.
Every 2 years, the United States invites its allies and partners to the world's largest naval exercise, the Rim of the Pacific, or RIMPAC. With 40 ships, 150 aircraft, and 25,000 personnel from 29 countries participating this year, the aim is to send a message of power and unity.
The thinking on deterrence has evolved in the 3 decades since the end of the Cold War, but its pillars remain the same. Clearly defined red lines, the power to enforce them, and the resolve to retaliate if the adversary fails to comply. And it's vessels like this one, the USS Carl Vinson, that are designed to project that power.
As impressive as this floating city is, it still brings to mind the old type of thinking on deterring conflicts. If deployed to counter the Chinese Coast Guard's water cannons in the South China Sea, would it avoid confrontation?
I worry about escalation. So I worry about the first shots being fired and then having a situation in which we are forced to respond or not respond with all the consequences that either choice would lead to. The point of RIMPAC and all these exercises is to prevent us from getting into that situation in the first place. And I again worry that we're not doing enough.
The concept of deterrence has evolved because we're facing a very different kind of challenge in the PRC, and it has broad claims to territorial waters, for instance, and it is willing to challenge them in a way that places are not necessarily accustomed to, such as these so-called gray zone tactics. Those have been common in much of the South China Sea. So how does the U.S. react to these more gray areas? That's a big part of what deterrence is now.
For the full version of that report, visit our YouTube channel or the TaiwanPlus website. Now, Jessica, deterrence comes in many different shapes, sizes, forms, whatever you want to call it. I want to ask you, how has deterrence, though, changed given the new threats that we're facing in the region?
Well, I would first say that when considering deterrence, the frustration with it is that we only know when it doesn't work. So trying to figure out if it's actually working is not something that we can actually figure out, because we don't know necessarily what the decision calculus is of the opposition. I will say that it's changed, especially as the technology in nuclear weapons and such, and especially North Korea, as they continue to to evolve and advance their nuclear weapons, that is changing the deterrent. There's the concern that if they eventually are able to demonstrate the ability to strike the United States with a nuclear weapon, that's going to then change the question about, for instance, if the U.S. will be able or willing to come to allies' defense in the region. So that's going to change the deterrence conversation.
And Raymond, I want to get your thoughts on this deterrence because the United States, an aircraft carrier, one of the clearest forms of power projection. The United States used to be able to just come very close to Taiwan, and that was a clear deterrent in making sure that China didn't take anything more escalatory in nature. But is that the case anymore? Is that working, and will that work going forward?
Obviously China has increased its ability to conduct long-range strike missions, which means that the U.S. carriers and other ships just can't get as close to the Chinese shore or Taiwan. At least they can, but they face much greater dangers than they used to. I think the other major element, and I think Jessica's absolutely correct, we don't really know when we're deterring because deterrence happens in the mind of your adversary. What you're telling them is, if you do this, I will respond with this. And you're hoping that whatever this thing you're going to respond with convinces them not to do something. But that ultimately happens in their head. And I think what is so difficult about the last 5-10 years is that the Chinese political system used to have many touch points with not just the United States, but the rest of the world. The party was in power. And so you could talk to the Minister of Commerce or the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Minister of Defense and get their input into the Chinese policymaking process. In the last 5 years, since the 20th Party Congress, however, we're seeing a consolidation of power such that President of China, Xi Jinping, is to use a jargon term, a personalistic dictatorship. All the decisions really just come down to him. So instead of trying to deter an entire system, which has its own checks and balances, we're now just trying to deter one individual. And it's really hard to know what is in the psychology of a single individual. Are they weighing things in a kind of clear, rational cost-benefit analysis, or are they becoming more like Vladimir Putin, where it's surrounded by yes men, paranoid, isolated, making decisions probably not on the basis of the best information. I am concerned about the degree to which deterrence has been working over the past 5 years, but I'm actually more and more concerned about how deterrence is going to work over the course of the next 10, 15 years. Xi Jinping is nowhere close to where Vladimir Putin is right now in terms of isolation and being surrounded by yes men. But that's only a matter of time. And as we go on, what really are the factors that will deter become harder and harder to identify and therefore leverage.
And Jessica, I want to get your reaction to that off the back of what Raymond said about going forward. How are we going to communicate that clearly? In deterrence, communication is a really big form of that. You look at the United States when it comes to Taiwan, we've had Biden say that, when it comes to Taiwan, he said yes a couple times, but we still maintain the policy of, strategic ambiguity, not making it clear whether we're going to do something. But going forward, do you think that the United States is maybe, I don't want to say too wordy, but too strategic, too diplomatic in the way it maybe displays how that deterrence is being displayed in Asia and the wording it uses for these allies and partners?
I would say no. One thing that I really saw in the region when I especially was in South Korea and some time in Japan is that our allies really pay attention to the words that we use and if there's any changes in them. And so they want to make sure that they're continuing to see the commitment from us. I mean, just little tweaks of words and statements. I would get phone calls, for instance, when I was in South Korea. But at the same time, there's always a lot of focus on military exercises and the military commitment and our military posture. I would like to see more continued and increased political engagements that display that these leaders are continuing to work with each other, talk about issues. I would love, for instance, I've been saying this for a few years now, I would love to see a senior leader, head of state tabletop exercise, when they get to grapple with decisions militarily wise, I'm a little biased, but I always feel that I am confident that militarily we can meet whatever objective our leaders set forth, but do our political leaders, will they agree on in-state objectives? So going forward, especially as we're going to see leadership changes in Japan, I think as far as the deterrence conversation and ensuring that we are able to have the same commitment to our allies and have that same assurance, we're going to need more and more senior leader engagement.
Raymond, I want to leave it with you. Going forward, talk about deterrence for Taiwan. What will be the biggest thing that deters China from making that move?
Well, if I knew that, I'd be paid a lot more. I think the main issue is that, Taiwan has to have the ability to make any type of Chinese coercion unacceptably costly to Beijing. And in that sort of situation, I think you just engage in, to some extent, worst-case scenario planning. So bulking up its defenses, tightening its alliance, partnerships, trying to, where possible, to internationalize any particular issue, such that when China does something, everyone in the region recognizes, yeah, it's China's fault, and pushes China further and further into isolation. The other element I would say that I think tends to be missing from U.S. security discussions is actually economics. When we think about IPEF or the TPP, I recall, I think former now Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, who said, look, when talking about the TPP, the fact that the U.S. wasn't going to sign on to it, he said, look, this is a mark of your credibility. Your credibility is on the line. In paraphrasing, if you can't even do economic engagement, why should we trust that you're going to put boots on the ground and American lives on the line to defend their actual region? The U.S. having a more coherent economic strategy and economic engagement with the Asian region, one, will pull those countries away, diversify their markets and their trade relations and investment relations away from China, and also stand as a sign of American credibility that, yes, we're willing to put money and we're willing to put our prestige and our troops on the line for the defense of what is ultimately the most economically vibrant and, I think, geostrategically important region in the world going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think this is a good way to, bring it back to what Jessica said, which is that we'll never know unless it happens. So let's make sure that we never find out what happens. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time to continue the discussion. I just want to thank Jessica Taylor and Raymond Guo for coming on today's show. And for our viewers everywhere, it's been good to have your company. If you've enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.